to it.
Great. Thanks, Corey. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I know we're getting to the end of this. So today we've heard a lot about various topics related to API security. And one of the things, kind of to wrap everything together really nicely, is to talk about, now that you've learned about or you've identified all of the risks, all of the concerns, all of the things that are important to API security, how do you write that policy? And we've heard a lot, we've seen a lot over the past year and a half of the explosion of Gen AI, things like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, um, Microsoft Copilot. And it's important to consider that while Gen AI can be a really good thing for getting the basics, when it comes to things like writing a security policy, and especially an API security policy, ChatGPT may not always be the right approach. Gen AI may not always be the right approach. There are ways, certainly, to use it. So today, what we're going to really talk about is what makes a good API security policy and why Gen AI may not be the end all be all when it comes to writing your policies. So really, when we talk about what an API policy is, we're talking about a clear set of rules, guidelines, standards to govern how the API is going to be designed, how it's implemented, how it's secured, how it's used, the life cycle of that API from ideation to implementation. And this matters because you want to provide structure and consistency to the development. We talk about the secure development life cycle. Well, having a policy, having a set of guidelines really drives and helps the developers drive that level of consistency so that the APIs that are developed by your organization get are developed or utilized or implemented in a consistent fashion. All of this helps to mitigate security risk because at the end of the day, we're all about mitigating the risks to our organizations. It also ensures fair usage. It also ensures that API is being used appropriately. There may be a license requirement. There may be an issue or some concern that you want to make sure is that the API is being used properly. It also helps to manage developer expectations. Developers, when they're building the APIs or when they're implementing an API or using an API, need to understand what is security going to require of them. What is the security team going to want you to do? What are the controls? What are the guidelines? What are the standards that need to be implemented? And finally, an API policy is going to make sure and should make sure that you're achieving the business's goals. Are you using an API, again, for the right reason, but are you using it in a way that is going to help the business? Or is this API really just being used for some other reason or not going to actually provide the level of kind of assurance, but the level of requirement that the business wants? So what are the key components of an API policy? Well, the first thing you want to always make sure your API policy has is design standards. You want it to talk about what principles exist. What are the guidelines for how it should be designed? Should it, is it going to abide by RESTful principles? What's the naming convention? It's a lot easier to track and monitor and manage and control the inventory your API assets if you use a consistent naming convention. The other thing is it will certainly help your security team if there's an issue, determine, and even your development team, determine, was this an API that was a test API? Was this an API that was in development? was this actually the production API? And what does it actually do, or what tool is it associated with? If you just call it API 1, API 2, API 3, or if one team calls names them using one convention and another uses another convention, you're going to run into it's going to make it very difficult to track 6 months from now or a year from now and remember, what was that API? Which team built that API? Why did we create this API? Having that consistent naming convention helps. The other thing you want to call out in your policy for sure is the versioning strategy. How are you going to determine what is a major and a minor update? When do I change the version number? What is the communication strategy behind versioning? Because you want to make sure when you're developing your APIs that you've got not only a consistent API versioning strategy, but a consistent set of standards behind why a version change occurred and when a version change occurred. And most importantly, you want to have error handling practices. What's the practice? What is the procedure when there's an error? Can you push to production a fix for an error? Does it need to go through some sort of structured practice, some sort of structured governance process, or can you just implement it? Additionally, important to talk about the security requirements. So you have your design standards, how do we build it, but also how do we secure it? What authentication mechanisms are allowed? What are the guidelines behind those authentication mechanisms? As we know, authentication and authorization and data protection and rate limiting and throttling, and this is OWASP top 10. These are key things that I know are discussed in the API security course and the OWASP top 10 course here at API at AppySec University. But these are things you need to be considering, because we're seeing more and more that the two kind of most important, most significant, often exploited elements of either APIs or any real controls or any real systems are identity authentication related and authorization role-based access related. So what are those controls? What are those mechanisms? What's required of the developers and of the individuals who are managing the APIs? Obviously, you also want to talk about encryption. What levels of encryption are needed? What types of encryption are needed? What things should be done from a data protection, data handling? And this is where some of those compliance requirements come into play. I know the last speaker was talking a little bit about HIPAA. Data protection, encryption can be a key element to determining whether or not you've actually had a HIPAA breach. I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with HIPAA breaches before, and being able to show that the data was encrypted can often help you avoid some of the dodgier and more problematic outcomes of a HIPAA related issue. Also, what levels of rate limiting or throttling are going to be implemented, at what point, what are the thresholds as well, in order to protect against DOS attacks or DDoS attacks, or issues with just latency of the API. Another thing to consider is usage guidelines. What are the terms of service? What are the acceptable use policies for the API? Having that in your policy, having those defined in your policy, will help you help inform not only the developers, not only the security team, but also those people who are going to have to go sell or support this. They can be looking at what the terms of service are. Having that well defined, or the guidelines for that defined, will also help your legal team when it comes to addressing questions of terms of service. What are the SLAs that you're going to require uh, when there are issues, or that you're going to commit to when there are issues? How can this API be used? Rate limits. How are you going to limit how many calls can be made per minute, per hour, per day? Um, are you limited on how many you can do? And your policy needs to say that no team, no department, no team, no developer can have more than X number of calls per day or per hour or per minute or whatever. Also, what are the caching policies? What kind of, how's it going to store data? We've seen recently, while it's not, it is an API of sorts. We've seen recently some questions about the caching policies related to the use of Microsoft OpenAI, Azure OpenAI, and the fact that some of their policies may not have been as well defined as they should have been. The other important thing to include in your API policy is what documentation is required. Now, I'm not by any means suggesting that you should include the documentation, but you should include, we expect for every new API that you're going to create this list of documentation that's required. You're going to have these types of examples or tutorials. You're going to require these change logs. Change log needs to be completed every time there's a major change, or every time there's a minor change, or anytime there's any change. And here's how often that should be updated. Here's where it should be stored as well. There are some things to consider when you're talking about creating your API policy. So knowing what to put in the policy is one thing. Considering certain things is another. And you might think of these as best practices, but I don't like using the term best practices because, again, as we're talking about here, one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And what works in one organization is not going to work in another. It's a very different thing. An API policy for Google is going to be very different than an API policy for a retail organization or oil and gas company. The API policy needs to really fit your organization. The key things to consider if you're sitting here going, I'm going to come out of this conference and, Dan and Corey and all the speakers have convinced me my organization needs an API policy, and we've got to write this, and this is important. Here are the things to keep in mind. First of all, involve stakeholders. Get input from developers, security, legal, the business units. Don't build the policy in a vacuum. When you try to build policies in vacuums, you end up finding that either they are overly restrictive, or they haven't considered the realistic outcomes, or they've limited the business. And a policy that doesn't involve all the stakeholders early on is less likely to be followed appropriately and be maintained appropriately. Second is start simple and iterate. You don't have to boil the ocean in your first policy. Your first policy does not need to address every possible scenario for your organization. Create a basic policy. Create a good enough, a minimum viable product for a policy, and then iterate on it. We set out the top standards or the top requirements, and now we're going to add this, and then we're going to add this, and now we're going to add this. Same way you would build software, you can iterate on your policy. It doesn't have to address everything out of the gate. However, Clarity is key. Remember that the people who are reading this policy may or may not be technical by their nature. They may not be people who live in API security every day. Your terms of service, your acceptable use policy for API needs to be able to be read by somebody in sales or somebody on the business side, because they're the ones who are going to implement it. You don't want to use a lot of technical jargon or make it overly complicated for them to understand. It's also important to ensure that the policy has some level of enforceability. Just saying we don't want you to do this is part of the game, part of the picture, but the other part has to be, here's what happens if you don't. Here's how we are going, if you use a policy, if you do this while developing the policy, the API, this action will be taken. If you include if you include a call that you're not allowed to make, we reserve the right to automatically to remove that, or to write you up, or take some sort of disciplinary action. The other important thing with any policy, but especially an API policy, is that it be set for regular review, that you revisit it up and update the policy regularly, because the technologies, the needs are going to change. You might have a policy right now that says TLS 2.0 is okay. 6 months from now, you might go, oh, you know what, now we need to do TLS 3.0 or 4.0 or whatever, because something new came out. That's an important thing to kind of keep in mind as you're moving forward. Oh, excuse me, sorry. A word of caution. This is where the Gen AI and policy creation discussion comes into play. You might be inclined to say, I'll just have ChatGPT write my policy for me. It'll get me where I need to be. Problem with Gen AI is it's going to lack nuance. APIs have have a lot of nuance to them, and a lot of specificity to them, and a lot of things that make them unique. And again, as we said, one size doesn't always fit. Gen AI is not going to fully grasp the subtle complexities and the specific business needs that your API policy should address. So remember, at the beginning, we talked about the need for the API policy to help with aligning with the business's goals. Gen AI is not going to have that level of knowledge and nuance about your business. It's going to create something that is one size fits all. The great example of this idea of using something that works one place will work another. The story that is about Apple and JCPenney. The guy who was well known for developing the Apple stores was hired by JCPenney to come in and redesign their stores using the same model that Apple had used, because Apple was so successful with its stores. And it didn't work. It failed miserably, because this idea that just because it works here, it's going to work here is very rarely the case. So it's important that, yes, while you ground yourself in a standard or a set of controls, every one of these controls may need to be tweaked slightly to work for your organization. There may be a control, there may be a requirement that the best practices say should be done, but you go, yeah, you know what, our organization, this is not going to work. As with any use of Gen AI, there's a potential for inaccuracies. Gen AI is coded and built to achieve a specific mission. So if you say, generate for me a policy on API security, Gen AI sees that as, I need to create a policy, and no matter what, that's what I need to do. So it will generate what may seem like plausible content simply because it needs to achieve its mission. We saw this, again, to use another example. We've seen this in the academic world with scholarly citations. You will say, write me, 500 words on this topic and provide me 5 citations. And what you'll find is it will give you a properly formatted citation. And it looks properly formatted, it looks appropriate, but when you then go look for that actual item, it doesn't exist, because from the Gen AI's standpoint, it did what it needed to do. It gave you a citation. It doesn't care if it's accurate. It's not, it may not be pulling. It's only as good as the data it's been given and the mission it's being asked to achieve. The other thing is, not everything that is recommended is a best practice. Gen AI might suggest a configuration or a practice that is either outdated or that could introduce some level of vulnerability into your API. And then finally, API policy, Gen AI is not going to have the scope of legal requirements and compliance requirements that work for your organization and that apply to your organization. Therefore, it's not going to know what is and isn't legally allowed necessarily. So you might get a policy that has legal considerations that are problematic. With that, we've got about 3 minutes left. I'm welcome any questions in the chat. And thank you all for your time today and for hanging in there this late in the day.
Dustin, thanks so much. Do you think, let's see, maybe compliance officers should start searching through policies for Delve and instances of that?
For what? I'm sorry?
Delve. There was a phenomenon from 2023 and beyond where Delve in titles has
Yes.
gone up in usage by 20 times previous years.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot, and I want to be clear. I'm not saying you shouldn't use Gen AI at all. There is a lot of really good that comes from it. It can get you a good start, but don't be the lawyer who writes his entire brief and gives citations from Gen AI and then hands it in and says, "Oh, look, I wrote my argument," and then you find out that the citations were all fake. Don't just that we have this inane belief that if the AI did it, if the automation did it, it's got to be right, and it's not always going to be correct. It's not always going to be the right thing for your organization, and it's important to just be aware of that, but also think about, does this policy really address what's going to work for my organization?
Yeah, I've definitely had that experience firsthand where I've used prompts that'll say something like, give me the top 10 resources in AI security or API security. And 9 of them are real. Titles, people are real. 1 of them is completely fake, completely made up. Professors that are at University of Florida with titles of things that don't exist. And I've, just to play around with it, really dug in. Who is this person? Where are they? What do they do? And it'll keep giving you answers all the way down. And then once you've, try to turn the tables and say, this person isn't real, why did you lie to me? And it's like, oh, sorry, I have to give an answer.
Or you say, or you could say, hey, write me this Python code, and it'll use all the right things, but then you go and put it in Python and it doesn't work, and you're like, why didn't it work? I thought it was, I mean, I asked you to write me the, because it put all the pieces in place. And if you looked at like, if there was a log of, did you successfully complete the code you were, the mission you were supposed to complete for the Gen AI, it would say, yeah, it successfully did what it was supposed to. It wrote you the Python code you needed. It wrote you the API syntax you needed, but it didn't work because either it's not for that type of system, the name of the field is incorrect, something is off there. you know it's not a just do it and blindly accept it. And that's something that I think we all as humans have struggled with, is this idea that the AI is correct. I mean, if the AI is getting every single thing correct and not making any mistakes, then we need to start to worry, because